There was a time when the world believed it could understand itself, not through power, not through conquest, not through fear, but through knowledge. Long before modern nations existed, before borders hardened and calendars aligned, there was a radical belief shared by a small group of visionaries. They believed that if all human knowledge could be gathered in one place, truth itself would emerge. Not opinion, not mythology alone, but understanding. That belief gave birth to a city. And that city gave birth to something humanity would never see again: Alexandria. From the moment it was founded, Alexandria was not meant to be ordinary. It was designed as an experiment. A city where the greatest minds of the ancient world could gather, exchange ideas, and push human thought beyond its limits. Egypt brought ancient wisdom carved into stone and memory. Greece brought philosophy, logic, and debate. Persia brought astronomy and mathematics. India brought numerical systems and early science. Alexandria stood at the crossroads of civilizations. And at its heart stood a structure that would define human ambition for centuries: the library. But to understand why the library mattered, you must understand what the ancient world was like before it existed. Knowledge was fragile. Scrolls were rare. Books were copied by hand. Ideas traveled slowly, often dying before they reached another city. If a city burned, its knowledge burned with it. If a scholar died without students, his ideas vanished forever. The world was constantly forgetting itself. The Library of Alexandria was created to stop that forgetting. Its mission was simple, terrifying, and unprecedented: to collect every piece of knowledge ever written, every scroll, every poem, every scientific observation, every religious text, every myth, law, medical record, and philosophical argument. Nothing was too small, nothing was too dangerous, nothing was forbidden. This was not censorship. This was preservation. Ships arriving at Alexandria's harbor were not just carrying spices and gold. They carried books, and every ship was searched. If scrolls were found, they were taken to the library. The originals were kept. Copies were made and returned to the owners. Sometimes the copies were marked for the owner. The originals were marked from the ships. The library did not borrow knowledge, it absorbed it. Inside its halls worked scholars from every known land. They were given food, housing, and protection. They did not need to worry about survival. Their only responsibility was to think, to read, to compare ideas, to argue fiercely, to test theories against reality. This was not a quiet place. It was loud with debate. Mathematicians argued over numbers that described the universe. Astronomers argued over the movement of the stars. Physicians argued over the structure of the human body. Philosophers argued over the nature of reality itself. And from those arguments came breakthroughs that would shape history. Within the library, scholars calculated the circumference of the Earth with astonishing accuracy, centuries before modern instruments existed. They mapped the stars with precision that would not be matched again for over 1,000 years. They studied anatomy, surgery, and medicine in ways the medieval world would later consider forbidden. They wrote texts that challenged the gods, questioned rulers, and explored ideas far ahead of their time. The library was not simply recording history, it was accelerating it. Some historians believe the library held mechanical designs that hinted at early engines. Others believe it contained advanced geographical maps, showing parts of the world long before they were officially discovered. Whether all of that is true no longer matters, because none of it survived. And that is where this story begins to darken. Because the greatest danger to knowledge is not destruction, it is power. As Alexandria grew, so did its influence. And influence attracts attention. Rulers began to understand that whoever controlled knowledge could shape the future. At first, the library was protected, funded generously, celebrated as the crown jewel of civilization. But political priorities change. Empires rise. Empires fall. And with every shift in power, the value of knowledge was questioned. Was it worth protecting? Was it dangerous? Was it necessary? Slowly, subtly, the answers began to change. Funding declined. Scholars left. Catalogs stopped being updated. Scrolls deteriorated without care. No alarms were raised, because nothing dramatic was happening, and that is why no one noticed the first cracks. The library did not collapse. It began to fade, and fading is harder to stop than fire, because fire demands action. Neglect does not. As the library faded quietly, the world around it grew louder. Alexandria was no longer the uncontested center of power it once had been. Rome rose. New capitals demanded attention. Military strength began to matter more than intellectual depth, and knowledge, once seen as humanity's greatest weapon against ignorance, became something else entirely. It became inconvenient. Because knowledge does something rulers fear. It remembers. It remembers older laws, forgotten freedoms, alternative ways of living. It preserves ideas that challenge authority and question tradition, and that made the library dangerous. Not because it preached rebellion, but because it refused certainty. Within its walls, there was no single truth. There were many, competing, contradicting, coexisting. For empires that relied on control, this was a problem. For belief systems that demanded obedience, it was worse. The library did not tell people what to believe. It showed them everything that had ever been believed, and allowed them to decide. That freedom was its greatest strength, and its greatest weakness. The first major wound often blamed for the library's destruction came during a civil war involving Julius Caesar. Fighting spilled into Alexandria. Fires erupted near the harbor. Warehouses burned. Some scrolls were lost. How many? No one knows. Some ancient sources claim thousands. Others claim far fewer. But what matters most is this: the library survived. And because it survived, humanity assumed it always would. This assumption would prove fatal. After the fire, the library was never fully restored to its former glory. Collections were fragmented. Some texts were moved. Others vanished into private hands. Still, the institution remained. But it was no longer the unstoppable force it once had been. As Roman rule solidified, practical concerns replaced intellectual ambition. Administrators replaced scholars. Efficiency replaced curiosity. The library became a symbol rather than a priority, and symbols are easy to neglect. Then came a deeper transformation, a shift not of politics, but of belief. As new religious movements spread across the ancient world, they brought with them certainty, absolute truth, divine authority, and certainty does not coexist easily with inquiry. Texts that contradicted doctrine were no longer studied. Then they were no longer copied. Then they were no longer preserved. They were not burned in rage. They were ignored. And in the ancient world, being ignored was a death sentence. Scrolls deteriorate quickly when not maintained. Ink fades. Papyrus crumbles. Entire works can vanish within decades if not recopied. And so knowledge began to disappear quietly, line by line, shelf by shelf, generation by generation. Imagine standing in a hall, once filled with the combined intelligence of humanity, and watching it empty, not because someone destroyed it, but because no one cared enough to save it. This is the most uncomfortable truth about the Library of Alexandria. It was not taken from us. We let it go. As centuries passed, references to the library grew fewer. Scholars spoke of it in the past tense. What remained was scattered among smaller collections, temples, and private archives. But without a central mission, without protection, without urgency, those fragments followed the same fate. Lost, forgotten, destroyed by time. By the time later conquerors entered Alexandria, there was little left to destroy. The library had already died. What they found was an echo, and echoes do not survive history. This is why historians cannot agree on when the library fell. There was no single moment, no definitive end, because you cannot pinpoint the moment something stops being valued. It happens slowly, quietly, almost politely, and then one day it is gone. The tragedy of the library is not just what was lost, it is what could have been. Consider this. If even a fraction of the library's knowledge had survived, humanity's technological and scientific timeline might look very different. Medicine could have advanced centuries earlier. Navigation might have connected the world sooner. Philosophy might have evolved with deeper understanding instead of repetition. Entire dark ages might never have occurred, but that knowledge did not survive, and we cannot measure what never existed. That uncertainty is the library's final cruelty. We know it mattered, we know it was extraordinary, but we will never know how extraordinary. And so the story of the Library of Alexandria is not a story of destruction, it is a story of forgetting, and forgetting is far more dangerous, because it convinces us it can never happen again. What makes the loss of the Library of Alexandria so haunting is not just that it vanished, but that it vanished without resistance. There were no riots demanding its protection, no armies sent to defend it, no global outrage, because the world did not yet understand what was being lost. In the ancient world, people believed knowledge could always be rediscovered, that wisdom was cyclical, that what had once been known would one day return. They were wrong. Knowledge is not eternal. It is fragile, and when it disappears, it often takes centuries to return, if it ever does. The scholars of Alexandria understood this. That is why they copied relentlessly, why they argued over accuracy, why they preserved multiple versions of the same text. They knew that ideas survive only when humans actively protect them. But when the institution weakened, that protection vanished, and so did the urgency. As generations passed, fewer people remembered what the library had truly been. To some, it became legend. To others, exaggeration. Stories replaced reality, and stories are easy to dismiss. This is how the greatest loss in intellectual history became a footnote. Not because it was small, but because it was inconvenient to remember. The surviving world moved on. Europe entered periods of instability. Knowledge fragmented. Monasteries preserved what little they could, but without access to the library's vast collections, progress slowed. Ideas were rediscovered rather than built upon. The same questions were asked again. The same answers were debated as if for the first time. Humanity began repeating itself. This repetition is one of the clearest signs of lost knowledge. When civilizations advance, they do not circle back. They move forward. But after Alexandria, humanity stalled. Centuries passed before mathematics regained its momentum, before medicine advanced beyond ancient limitations, before astronomy again questioned humanity's place in the universe. The silence left by the library was vast, and few noticed. The loss was too abstract, too gradual, too quiet, and that silence shaped the world that followed. The medieval era was not dark because humans lacked intelligence. It was dark because they lacked access. Access to ideas that had already existed, access to experiments already conducted, access to debates already resolved. Humanity did not fall backward because it was incapable. It fell backward because it forgot. And forgetting is contagious. When knowledge is lost, curiosity weakens. When curiosity weakens, exploration slows. When exploration slows, fear takes its place. Fear of the unknown, fear of questioning, fear of thinking beyond what is allowed. This fear shapes societies for generations, and it all traces back to the quiet disappearance of a single institution. The Library of Alexandria was not just a building. It was a mindset. A belief that understanding the world mattered more than controlling it. That belief did not survive, and that may be the library's greatest loss, because buildings can be rebuilt. But mindsets are harder to recover. The ancient world briefly believed that truth could be pursued openly. without punishment. That belief flickered, and then went out. What followed were centuries where knowledge was guarded, restricted, and filtered through power. And power has never favored truth. This is why the library still matters, because it represents a moment in human history when curiosity outweighed fear, when disagreement was not a threat, when knowledge was shared, not owned. And that moment ended, not with destruction, but with neglect. The lesson of Alexandria is not about fire. It is about responsibility. Every generation inherits knowledge, and every generation decides what survives. The scholars of Alexandria understood this. The world that followed did not. And so the greatest collection of human thought ever assembled faded into memory. Not stolen, not conquered, but abandoned. And that abandonment changed everything. As centuries passed, the memory of the Library of Alexandria began to blur. What was once a living institution slowly transformed into legend. Writers spoke of it in fragments. Historians debated its size, its contents, its fate. And the more time passed, the easier it became to dismiss its importance. After all, if something truly mattered, would it really be allowed to disappear? That question hides a dangerous assumption, that humanity always protects what is valuable. History proves the opposite. The ancient world was not destroyed by ignorance. It was undone by selective memory. Certain ideas were preserved because they were useful. Others were discarded because they were inconvenient. The library did not filter knowledge. That alone sealed its fate. Because systems built on control cannot tolerate archives that remember everything. Within the library existed texts that challenged kings, questioned gods, and proposed realities far beyond accepted belief. Some argued that the universe was governed by natural laws rather than divine will. Others questioned the permanence of empires, suggesting all power was temporary. There were philosophies that rejected hierarchy altogether. Ideas like these do not disappear because they are wrong. They disappear because they are dangerous, and danger invites erasure. At first, the erasure was subtle. Texts were not copied. Scrolls were placed in storage rather than study. Languages fell out of use. Once a language dies, everything written in it becomes unreadable. Entire worlds can vanish simply because no one remembers how to read them. This happened again and again. The library's collection was multilingual, multicultural, and vast. But without scholars trained to preserve every tradition, the collection fragmented. What could not be understood was ignored. What was ignored decayed. What decayed vanished. And still, no one sounded an alarm, because loss without spectacle rarely inspires action. By the time later generations realized what Alexandria had been, it was already gone. They stood among ruins and tried to imagine greatness. But imagination is a poor replacement for memory. This is why the library became mythologized, because myth is easier than mourning. It is easier to imagine a single fire destroying everything than to accept that humanity simply stopped caring. One dramatic moment absolves responsibility. A slow collapse does not. The truth forces us to ask uncomfortable questions, not about the past, but about ourselves. Because the same patterns repeat. Civilizations accumulate knowledge. They celebrate it. They rely on it. Then they begin to believe it is permanent, that it will survive without effort. That belief is always wrong. The Library of Alexandria teaches us that knowledge requires constant defense, not just from enemies, but from neglect, from bureaucracy, from shifting priorities, from the temptation to believe that what has always existed will always exist. The library did not fail because its scholars were weak. It failed because the world around it changed faster than its protectors could adapt. Power moved, belief hardened. Curiosity was no longer rewarded, and without curiosity, knowledge suffocates. By the time the world fully realized what the Library of Alexandria had been, it was already too late. There were no catalogs left to consult, no complete inventories, no way to reconstruct what had vanished, only second-hand references, mentions in surviving texts that hinted at something far greater than what remained. And those hints are haunting. Ancient writers spoke of books that explained the movement of the heavens with mathematical precision, of medical texts describing surgeries that would not be performed again for centuries, of philosophies that treated humanity not as subjects of fate, but as participants in a universe governed by discoverable laws. These were not fantasies. They were observations, and they were lost. What survived into later eras was incomplete, fragmented, often misunderstood. Knowledge passed through filters of belief, power, and fear. What aligned with authority was preserved. What challenged it was quietly erased. This selective survival reshaped history. Entire branches of inquiry vanished. Questions humanity had already asked were forgotten. And when they were asked again, centuries later, they were treated as revolutionary. This repetition is the clearest sign of what Alexandria represented, a leap forward that humanity failed to hold on to. The library's disappearance did not just erase the past, it altered the future. Progress slowed, innovation staggered. Humanity spent generations rediscovering what it once knew. And during that time, suffering continued unnecessarily. Diseases went uncured. Technologies went undeveloped. Understanding was delayed, not because answers did not exist, but because access to them was lost. This is the true cost of forgetting. The Library of Alexandria was not a luxury. It was infrastructure. It supported civilization itself. When it disappeared, humanity lost more than books. It lost continuity, the ability to build directly upon its own achievements. Instead, progress became cyclical. Advance, collapse, rediscovery, repeat. This cycle defined much of human history after Alexandria, and it was avoidable. The library proved that knowledge could be centralized, preserved, and shared. It proved that collaboration across cultures was possible. It proved that curiosity could be institutionalized. And then it proved something else, that none of this is guaranteed. The world that followed Alexandria grew cautious. Knowledge was guarded rather than shared. Education became restricted, access became privilege, and with restriction came stagnation. This was not because humanity became less intelligent. It was because humanity became less brave. The courage to question faded. The courage to doubt authority weakened. The courage to preserve ideas that challenged belief disappeared. The library had embodied that courage, and when it vanished, so did that spirit. What remains today is an absence we can feel but not fully understand, because we do not miss what we never knew existed. We only sense the gap, the missing acceleration, the lost momentum, the unrealized potential. The Library of Alexandria stands as the greatest reminder that civilization is not defined by what it builds, but by what it chooses to protect. And protection is a choice, made every generation, again and again. The disappearance of the Library of Alexandria did not end curiosity, but it changed its shape. Without a central place to gather knowledge, ideas became isolated. Scholars worked alone or in small circles. Information traveled slowly, often distorted by time, translation, or ideology. Truth fractured. What had once been debated openly was now whispered cautiously, and the world adjusted to this smaller version of itself. Centuries later, when scholars in distant lands began rediscovering ancient ideas, they believed they were standing at the beginning of knowledge. They were not. They were standing in the ruins of something far older. Mathematical principles reappeared and were celebrated as breakthroughs. Astronomical models were praised as revolutionary. Medical practices were hailed as miracles. Yet many of these ideas had already existed. They had simply been forgotten. The loss of Alexandria created the illusion of progress, because rediscovery feels like invention, but it is not the same. True progress builds forward. Rediscovery rebuilds from rubble. This distinction matters, because rebuilding takes time, and time is the one resource humanity can never recover. Generations lived and died without access to knowledge that once existed. Lives were shortened, suffering endured, possibilities delayed, not because answers were unknown, but because they were unreachable. The library's absence became invisible. When something is lost slowly, people stop noticing the loss. They adapt to its absence, and adaptation creates acceptance. This is how humanity learned to live without Alexandria. Not with outrage, but with resignation. Over time, the idea of a universal library became unrealistic, idealistic, even dangerous. Knowledge centralized in one place seemed risky. Better to fragment it, better to control it, better to filter it. And so the very concept Alexandria represented was abandoned. The world learned the wrong lesson. Instead of understanding that knowledge must be protected, it decided knowledge must be managed. And management always involves limits. Who may learn? What may be taught? Which ideas are acceptable? Which are not? These limits shaped the centuries that followed. They shaped education, religion, politics, science. Every system that touched information inherited the fear Alexandria inspired. The fear of too much knowledge, the fear of questions without easy answers, the fear of losing control. This fear did not destroy humanity, but it restrained it. Progress continued, but cautiously. Curiosity survived, but quietly. Imagination endured, but within boundaries. The Library of Alexandria represented a moment when those boundaries did not exist, when humanity briefly believed it could know everything. That belief was audacious, dangerous, and extraordinary. Its loss reminds us that ambition alone is not enough. Vision requires defense. Without it, even the greatest ideas dissolve. This is why the library still matters today, not because of nostalgia, but because it exposes a pattern humanity continues to repeat. We build systems of knowledge. We rely on them. Then we assume they will last without effort. They never do. The library was not destroyed by barbarians at the gate. It was undone by complacency, by the quiet assumption that what existed yesterday would exist tomorrow. That assumption is always fatal. The greatest misunderstanding about the Library of Alexandria is that it was a failure. It was not. For centuries it worked. It proved that humanity could organize knowledge, preserve it, and use it to advance understanding beyond any single culture or belief. The failure came later. And the failure was not intellectual. It was moral. Because protecting knowledge requires humility. It requires accepting that future generations matter more than present convenience. The rulers who allowed the library to fade did not believe they were making a destructive choice. They believed they were making a practical one. Resources were needed elsewhere, priorities had shifted, the world was changing, and knowledge, they assumed, could wait. This assumption is one humanity has repeated endlessly, and every time the cost has been immeasurable. The Library of Alexandria forces us to confront an uncomfortable reality. That civilization is not defined by intelligence. It is defined by values. A society can be brilliant and still destroy its own future if it fails to protect what matters. Alexandria was brilliant, but brilliance without commitment is fragile. The scholars who once filled its halls understood this. They knew that knowledge required constant renewal, that scrolls had to be copied again and again, that ideas had to be debated repeatedly to stay alive. When that cycle stopped, knowledge began to decay. And decay does not announce itself. It progresses quietly, until one day, absence replaces presence, and no one remembers when the change occurred. This is why the library's loss feels unreal, because it did not happen all at once. It slipped through history's fingers. The silence it left behind became normal. Generations grew up without realizing anything was missing. They assumed the limits of their knowledge were natural. They were not. They were inherited. Inherited from a moment when humanity chose not to care enough. The tragedy of Alexandria is not that it was destroyed. It is that it was allowed to end. And allowance is a choice. Always. Every generation makes choices about what to preserve. Language, art, science, truth. When preservation fails, loss follows. Not immediately, but inevitably. The library teaches us that knowledge is not permanent. It survives only through effort, through belief, through protection. Without these, even the greatest achievements dissolve into myth. And myths do not advance civilization. They only remind us of what we failed to keep. Alexandria is remembered not because it fell, but because it showed us what was possible. A world where curiosity outweighed fear, where disagreement fueled progress, where ideas were valued above power. That world existed, briefly, and then it disappeared. Not because it was impossible, but because it was unguarded. The lesson is not that such a place cannot exist again. The lesson is that if it does, it must be defended relentlessly, because knowledge does not defend itself. It depends on us, and it always has. The silence left by the Library of Alexandria did not echo immediately. It took generations to feel its weight. At first, the world adapted. Smaller centers of learning emerged. Knowledge survived in fragments, scattered across regions, guarded by institutions that filtered what could be taught and what could not. But something fundamental had changed. Knowledge was no longer universal. It was conditional. Who you were determined what you could learn. Where you lived determined what you could question. What you believed determined what you were allowed to know. This was the opposite of Alexandria's vision. The library had believed that truth did not belong to any one people, nation, or faith. It belonged to humanity. That belief vanished with it. Over time, the absence of a shared foundation fractured understanding. Scholars no longer argued from the same sources. Ideas diverged. Misinterpretations multiplied. Without a central archive, truth became relative to location. And when truth becomes fragmented, power fills the gaps. Authority replaced inquiry. Tradition replaced exploration. Obedience replaced curiosity. This shift reshaped education itself. Learning became repetition rather than discovery. Students memorized accepted answers instead of questioning assumptions. Knowledge became something inherited, not pursued. And the cost of this shift was immense. Because innovation does not come from obedience, it comes from doubt. The Library of Alexandria had institutionalized doubt. It encouraged contradiction. It welcomed disagreement. It understood that truth emerges through conflict of ideas. When that environment disappeared, progress slowed again. Centuries later, during periods of rediscovery, scholars would marvel at ancient texts and wonder how civilizations so old could have known so much. They assumed those insights were isolated miracles. They were not. They were remnants, fragments of a system far more advanced than what followed. The library had connected minds across cultures. It had allowed ideas to evolve collectively. Without it, humanity returned to isolation, and isolation breeds repetition. The same debates reappeared. The same errors resurfaced. The same limitations constrained imagination. This is why the library's loss feels so vast, because it did not just erase information, it erased momentum. Humanity did not fall into darkness, it slowed into it, gradually, almost imperceptibly. And once slowed, acceleration became difficult. Every rediscovery required rebuilding. Every insight required starting over. The cost was not measured in years, it was measured in centuries. The Library of Alexandria represents the path humanity almost took, a path of cumulative knowledge, where progress stacked instead of resetting. That path was abandoned, and humanity adapted to a slower pace, a smaller vision, a narrower understanding of what was possible. This adaptation became normalized. Few questioned it, because few remembered anything different. This is the quiet power of forgetting. It reshapes expectations, it redefines limits, and it convinces people that what they have is all that can exist. The library proves that this is not true, that humanity once reached further, and could again. As the centuries unfolded, the world learned to live without the Library of Alexandria. And that may have been the most damaging outcome of all, because when loss becomes normal, ambition shrinks. Humanity did not stop seeking knowledge, but it stopped believing that knowledge could be complete. The idea of total understanding began to feel unrealistic, dangerous, even arrogant. Better to specialize, better to narrow focus, better to avoid questions without immediate answers. This cautious mindset shaped the intellectual world that followed. Instead of building grand systems of understanding, scholars worked in isolation. Instead of unifying knowledge, institutions divided it. Instead of preserving everything, they preserved what was useful. The result was progress, but limited, controlled, fragmented. The library had once believed that contradiction,